But also this breaking in the last couple of hours, the Church of England has failed to protect children from sexual abuse and created a culture where abusers could hide. A report has concluded. The independent inquiry into child sex abuse report said that the Church's failure to respond consistently to victims and survivors of abuse often added to their trauma. It added that alleged perpetrators were often given more support than victims, and also found examples of clergymen being ordained despite a history of child sex offences. How does this happen? The Church admitted progress to improve safeguarding had been too slow. In 2018, there were 2,500 safeguarding concerns reported to dioceses about either children or vulnerable adults, and 449 allegations of recent child sexual abuse. And of course, it has to be said, these are just the stories we know of. Richard Scorer is an abuse lawyer at Slater and Gordon and represented 20 survivors in this inquiry. Richard, good afternoon to you, sir. Nice to have you with us. This is clearly an incredibly distressing case for your clients and for others, of course. It does feel, even just reading out some of those words here, that the Church were too slow to act. It seems like we've sort of been in this place before.
Well, we have been in this place before. And I mean, this is a very, very damning report. It's very critical of the Church of England, and it's clear that the Church is continuing to fail victims and survivors. Even now, it's clear that bishops have far too much power and they're not using it wisely. It's clear that there's a huge amount of change that still needs to happen in the Church. So yes, it's a very damning report, and it's very distressing actually for victims and survivors to read it and to see the extent of the failure over many decades.
And one of the, to just put it in layman's terms, seems to be this kind of historic gathering and wagons circling around anyone who's a person of the cloth. Just appeared to sort of curiously, bearing in mind what we're dealing with and what these people did for a living, curiously protected by the establishment, their own establishment.
Yes, I mean, it's a sort of brotherhood where they all protect each other. And that's why I think the single biggest change we need in the future is what we call mandatory reporting. In other words, a law that says if people within an institution or an organisation know about abuse, then they have a legal duty to report that outside the institution, to report it to the police so that it can be looked at properly. The problem we've had over so many years is these things being dealt with in the house and often covered up, to protect the reputation of the Church.
I mean, do you think it was as basic as that it was all about the reputation? Was it the Church thinking they can redeem these people? Or was it, from a legal perspective, what do you think was going on? I mean, I would imagine it was incredibly frustrating just trying to get basic information in some cases.
Well, I think the pattern you see in the churches is that they obviously want to give the impression to the outside world that they're good people. And so when things happen inside the churches that are bad, they kind of want to keep that under wraps because of the reputational protection. The other issue, of course, is that child abusers are attracted to institutions where they can wield power over children. And it is very easy for somebody who says that they've got God on their side to silence a child. So all of those factors have come together and made the churches, I think, honeypots for these abusers.
And one is forced to not unreasonably wonder or even conclude that many of these people took jobs in that area for this very reason.
I think that's right. I think when you're dealing with any institution where people have access to children, you've got to recognise that heightened risk, and you've got to have measures in place to deal with it. And the Church has really failed very abjectly, in doing that, even though, as you say, there have been other inquiry reports that have reached similar conclusions. So we have to get to a point, I think, where we have changes in the law to stop this in the future.
What does it mean, Richard, for your clients, this, do we call it an admission from the Church? What are the implications of what's been said here?
Well, there have been a lot of apologies from the Church over the last 24, 48 hours. And, on one level, that's good. But as the report itself says, we need more than platitudes. They've got to be real changes which prevent this from happening in the future. In our view, and this is something that the inquiry will make recommendations about next year, we do need that mandatory reporting law. We do have to have a law that says if you know about abuse going on in an organisation, then you've got to report it to the police. I think we do need that change.
We know some people have been convicted, although I note that between 1940 and 2018, and the last time I looked, I think that's nearly 80 years, 390 clergy members and other church leaders were convicted of abuse. That doesn't, in the grander scale, seem an awful lot, but we can only deal with what is there. What is likely to happen now? Do you think we're going to see more people convicted as a result of this? Does it have any implications in that respect?
Well, I think what we need is to make sure that the church, when they hear about an allegation or they have a suspicion or concern, that they deal with it right away, rather than sort of pushing it back or turning a blind eye to it or hoping that it's not really happening. We have a sort of system where these things are dealt with right away. And as I think mandatory reporting is really the key to that, because if people know that they're legally obliged to report something to the police, then they can do that. The police can look into it. If there's any substance to it, it can be dealt with. If there isn't, then, everybody just moves on. But I think it needs that external oversight that comes from having that mandatory reporting.
Listen, Richard, thank you for your time, sir. Richard Scorer, abuse lawyer at Slater and Gordon, that represented 20 survivors in the child sex abuse inquiry. I mean, it's extraordinary to me, but not surprising in many ways. You haven't got to delve very deep. I'm thinking of films like Spotlight that highlighted abuse in the Catholic Church, and it's the fact that the abuse is there at all, in some respects. I mean, this, depending on, I suppose, the era in which you grew up in, there would have been a time, in the 40s and the 50s, if you'd have suggested that the local vicar was doing something they shouldn't be doing, or the priest was abusing choir boys and the like, it would have... And this was, I think, as much of the problem as the church itself, is that the people around, church-goers, the community, wouldn't have believed it either. Little Jimmy is making up stories about the priest. Why would he do that? Because he's a naughty boy. And these people acted with impunity, these abusers, in that respect, because it wasn't just their own establishment that was behind them, it was everything else as well. But you come more up to date and you think that would have sort of changed. And it really hasn't. I remember when the film Spotlight came out and debating it on air, I had a switchboard full of people who were absolutely incandescent. How dare Hollywood try to malign my faith? How dare you? And if you've seen Spotlight, you'll notice that the end credits, there is a whole list of areas where abuse was uncovered or is still ongoing. And curiously, people who've been convicted or found out were simply moved into other jobs in the same church establishment. In some cases, believe it or not, actually promoted to better jobs. It goes right to the Vatican. It goes right to Canterbury Cathedral. I mean, everyone's aware of this. And the closing of ranks is beyond obscene, bearing in mind what we're dealing with here. This isn't a case of a vicar who nicked some money from the contribution pot on a Sunday. This is about as industrial scale abuse and about as disturbing as it gets.